We have Mr. Lewin and Mr. Bailey and Mr. Milius. I've looked over this, and so the question is, the framework for deciding this is what is relevant. So the way this court determines relevance is based on California Evidence Code, Section 210. Evidence is relevant. Relevant evidence is evidence that's relevant to the credibility of a witness or hearsay declarant, or a tendency and reason to prove or disprove any disputed fact that is of consequence to the determination of the action. And what that means, you know, I'm going to go to Jefferson, and Section 19.9, Jefferson cites People versus Hill, 3 Cal. 4th 16 at page 29. Evidence is relevant when it tends to prove or disprove the ultimate facts in dispute, but also when it tends to prove intermediate facts. So we've gone through this analysis with 1101. So either an element of the crime or something from which one can reason that the element is present, and that applies also, of course, to defenses, whether it's relevant to a legal defense because it's an ultimate fact or an intermediate fact. The gist of what I heard, the most important part of that testimony was that there was a new investigation, and because of this new investigation in which Susan Berman was a witness, first of all, that Susan Berman was in fact a witness, whether or not Mr. Durst is guilty of killing Kathie Durst, she's a witness in a possible prosecution of Mr. Durst. So that's the most important part. The second, additionally, he's describing some aspects of his investigation that are relevant to facts. Time for new batteries. Relevant to facts in dispute. For instance, there was testimony about her refuting the idea that she had disappeared. Simply, I mean, they dragged the lake. There was a CODIS check, so there is additional work that shows, and there is some evidence here of phone calls, investigating the site of phone calls from the Pine Barrens, which is a place where it is surmised that and there is circumstantial evidence suggesting that she might have ended up there. Mr. Chesnoff has suggested, first of all, that this witness believed Dr. Cooperman's initial opinion was correct, that he had spoken to Kathie and not to Susan Berman, and for the purpose, and this is suggested as a reason why he did not speak to Susan Berman. He had testified that he had not spoken to Susan Berman. He explained that by saying he didn't want to generate publicity by talking to close friends right away. He had not spoken with her yet. He was about to speak to her. So this idea of why he did not speak to her is not really relevant. It's not really the issue, but it is, if there is some inconsistent statement. We did have Dr. Cooperman's testimony. Did this witness, in interviewing Dr. Cooperman, did he hear some consistent or inconsistent statement from Dr. Cooperman, Mr. Chesnoff?
He he heard a consistent statement.
Okay,
And
consistent with the
original
testimony?
identification, excuse me.
Yes.
With the original identification of it having been Kathie Durst who called Einstein.
All right, so that's a maybe. I'll get to you.
Can I just respond to that, because I think I can maybe help on this issue.
Okay, we'll go issue by issue if you think
Right,
that's
so-
better.
So what he said was, he said Dr. Cooperman articulated that it is unusual for students, I'm sorry, Dr. Cooperman stated that he thought the caller was Kathie Durst, but could not say for sure.
What statement did you want to introduce, Mr. Chesnoff? I'll let you say what you want to
I'm going
introduce.
to find it for you, Your Honor, because I gave the citation to Mr. Bailey earlier. So let me find the exact.
So we don't have any objection, Your Honor. It would be if he wants to, if the court first finds that that statement is either consistent or inconsistent, we don't have a problem with it coming in. I think it's consistent with his testimony, because he said originally he thought it was Kathie Durst because she said it was Kathie Durst.
All right, that's fine.
So we don't have an issue with that.
Good, let's keep going then.
Okay?
Let's go through it. I don't want to take too much time, jury's waiting.
That's not what Mr. Chesnoff wanted to ask. He wanted to ask about the witness telling Mark and Andrew in an interview that the witness believed Cooperman was right and that it was Kathie Durst. He wants to solicit the witness's belief that Dr. Cooperman was right or wrong.
I'm sorry, I thought we were talking about what this witness...
This witness was interviewed by Jarecki, and at the time he said that Cooperman told him it was Kathie who called. This witness said to Jarecki that Cooperman was confident that it was Kathie that called, and this witness said that he believed that Kathie called, and that the only confusion he had was he thinks that Kathie may have called Cooperman on the Friday before.
Okay, so that's his opinion is not relevant.
Well, no, it is, Your Honor, because he's telling the jury that the reason he didn't contact Susan Berman, because they're going to make a big thing about the fact that she wasn't contacted, is one reason. And I want to cross-examine and confront him on the idea that he didn't contact Susan Berman because as far as he was concerned, she wasn't a witness. And this goes to the question of whether or not she was an alibi,
All right,
which is the thrust of their case.
And Your Honor, in solving that issue, even though it's not necessary, if that's Mr. Chesnoff's concern, we are willing to stipulate to have the court instruct the jury that they are not to consider why Detective Becerra did not contact Susan Berman, but only that he didn't. That would then eliminate the issue that they're saying they're concerned about.
And that would eliminate my cross-examination and confrontation and show he's still a police officer, Your Honor. I'm allowed to tell the jury that someone that they bring as a police officer to further their case there's ways to impeach him and to show them that he told them something that may not be completely what the story was. I'll be honest with you, Your Honor. I asked the state why they were even calling him, because I knew that he was going to talk about the fact that he did this follow-up investigation. I want to read you a sample of something that we wrote over lunch as a cross. Detective, when you became involved in an investigation in which there was prior investigation, you want to rely on that prior investigation, correct? So you will examine what they did and the conclusions they came to, correct? Did you do that in this case? Which you did. Your investigation involved Susan because of a claim that she called the med school pretending to be Kathie, correct? So your decision whether to call Susan was based on more than just keeping things secret. It was based on part on whether Susan actually made that call. And that decision was based in part on the investigation previously done. And that investigation uncovered evidence, for example, that Kathie was seen in an apartment in New York after Durst supposedly killed her. So there was no reason for Susan to make the call because Kathie was still alive. I mean, I didn't tell him to call this guy, and I didn't tell him to tell the jury that he studied the whole thing and he went back and he investigated. Why are they allowed to talk about the parts of the investigation that helped them, and I can't talk about the parts of the investigation that helped me?
All right, so the defense has a counterpunch theory of relevance. In other words, whatever the DA presents, the defense can respond. So if the DA presents something that's completely irrelevant, that now is relevant and you can respond.
But we've been arguing to you, Your Honor, that this is irrelevant, and you've let them do it over and over again.
I heard no objection at all. I heard no objection.
Your Honor, we made these objections in the beginning, and we've told you over and over again that they are bringing in things that are extraneous. The whole thing about Kathie, just introduce the fact that she's missing. But instead, they put on the whole case about how she got killed. I mean, he said it multiple times. Either it's an accident, or Bob murdered her, she fell down the stairs. I mean, they've had their cake. I want to eat too.
Okay, well, I mean, that's rhetorical and interesting, and that kind of thing I think is good for a jury, but
But I won't be able to tell that to the jury.
Your Honor, we just tried to, Mr. Chesnoff laid out why it was he needed the information. We were going to stipulate to something, we don't even have to. As soon as we stipulate to it, he really shows the real reason, which is that I want to bring in all the evidence that the court has already said isn't coming in, and I want to bring it in to somehow show that he looked over the original investigation, and I'm going to bring in rank hearsay, which the court has said is not credible. So we tried to answer what they said they wanted, but that's not what they actually want.
no, I know it's not, but
By the way, Your Honor,
Yes.
the rank hearsay, this detective happens to believe.
What?
okay. I mean, a lot of the defense theory is what does the officer think? That's what the jury should do. Whatever the officer thinks, that's dangerous. You don't want that, because if you ask him what he thinks, it's actually not good for you. But you generally don't want the opinion of the officer, why he did something or what he thinks.
Generally, you do, Your Honor. except
Well,
in
you
this
do.
case-
Okay.
In this case, Your Honor, everything they did shows that he didn't kill her. Shows that he didn't kill anybody. Everything they've done.
Look, anything a detective has presented that's admissible, you can present, obviously. I mean, the point is to present evidence that raises a reasonable doubt, not to ask, not to insinuate, or, we've already been through this as far as the supposed New York witnesses that are...
The most important thing I
yeah.
want to talk about, Your Honor,
Yeah.
is Cooperman. Because Mr. Lewin has told this jury that she was killed because she provided the alibi for him. And I need to be able to ask about that.
So what they can ask about, Your Honor, is they can ask about prior inconsistent or prior consistent statements. That means what Cooperman said, not what the detective thought about what Cooperman said. And I think first, Your Honor, as I said, I don't believe that the statement that the witness has, which I just read to you, which is that he said he believed it was Kathie but was not sure, I don't believe that's either consistent or inconsistent. I mean, I think it's consistent with what he testified to. There's no impeachment. That's what he has said.
So he talked to Cooperman, and Cooperman made that statement to him. It's either consistent or it's inconsistent. What any of them said on a television show doesn't matter. It's what he personally asked this witness during his investigation. It's consistent with another statement.
Right, but that's what he's telling us. During my investigation, I spoke to Dr. Cooperman. He told me it was Kathie, and I believed him. That's what he said.
Okay. I mean, it just begs for the redirect. I mean, which I understand this. I mean, he had no reason. He didn't know her voice. He had no reason not to. Is what they're going to say, and you're going to say, "Oh, sure, he knew her," and that's fine. You can argue about that. But I mean, as far as anything about this shoehorning the previous investigation, well, detectives always want to know what somebody else did, so then going through this whole investigation by Struck that's untenable. I mean, you had Struck at a conditional examination. You had an opportunity to question Detective Struck. You did ask some questions to Detective Struck, which are in this that the jury's heard. So that was your opportunity to get material from Struck, not from this fellow read a file, and what does the file say, because that's hearsay.
He didn't just read a file, Your Honor. He went back and interviewed all the witnesses.
Right. And so you can obviously you can ask him about that. You talk to this witness, you talk to that witness, but as far as what they said to him, that's going to be hearsay.
And I can't elicit from him, rather than the specific statement, that based on what you heard you believed that the woman had been seen in New York? I can't ask him that.
Based on what you heard, you believed
And that's why
she had been, why is that relevant?
Why is that relevant?
Yeah.
Because that's why he didn't talk to Susan Berman, because he knew that Susan Berman could not have called the school because she was seen in New York at a time at the contemporaneous to when the call was
All
supposed
right,
to be.
so that objection to be sustained because the ultimate fact you're trying to prove is his reason for not talking to Susan Berman, which I don't think matters.
Your Honor,
It's not that he says he was going to talk to Susan Berman. Your question is he hadn't talked to her yet when she was killed. And
it's a long time into
Right.
it, too, Your Honor. It's not like 3 days later. He spent years investigating and never talked to her. I mean, Your Honor, my colleagues sent me 2 notes that I want to read into the record, if you don't mind.
Okay.
We're not offering it for the truth of the matter, but to show what he did and why.
Right, no. Well, and we've been through this. If what he did and why is relevant, I would allow the question. What he did and why. I mean, there is some testimony that is admissible to give context to the presentation of evidence he did find that is useful, right? So that's evidence which tends to prove an intermediate fact or an ultimate fact or to refute an intermediate fact or an ultimate fact. So if you can tie it to that, that's fine. So if it proves an element or a reason to believe an element is true. So try it that way and explain it to me. How this proves an element without using hearsay. Not what he believes or his opinion as to guilt or innocence or the intermediate fact, because his opinion isn't useful.
I know the prosecution did not introduce his evidence of what he did in the investigation because they thought it was irrelevant. So, Your Honor, if his...
It's not a counterpunch theory. In other words, because the people present it doesn't mean that... I mean, if they present something that's not relevant, what you do is you object to that irrelevant material. You can't wait for it to come in and say, aha, now this is relevant. That's not right. What's relevant is determined by Evidence Code 210, which tells us what relevant evidence is in California. So if you can connect it to a defense or to refuting an intermediate or ultimate fact, when I say intermediate fact, those facts from which you might infer the ultimate fact, a killing, intentional killing, a reason for a killing.
How about she wasn't a witness? How about Susan Berman isn't the witness?
Susan Berman is
not a witness.
That would be an element.
Okay, well, I think that's what this establishes. She wasn't a witness.
And tell me how it establishes that.
Because she didn't make the call that Mr. Lewin has made the benchmark of his case.
Okay, she didn't make the call.
Correct.
So she didn't make the call. But how does that mean that she's not a witness? Wouldn't she be called to be asked if she made that call?
Excuse me?
I mean, it's not the truth of the testimony. Remember, he can be innocent. He can be innocent of Kathie Durst's killing, but if he's going to be put on trial for it and she's a witness to it, he can't kill her. That's the point of this. In other words, witness killing is the special circumstance.
Okay.
So explain to me how she is not a witness if she is suspected of playing a part in this killing, even wrongly so.
Because she never told anybody. She never told anybody in law enforcement any facts relevant to this case, and the only representations that have been made about her potentially being a witness are the hearsay from people that never said it when it first started, and 20 years later had a fresh memory.
Now you're getting into argument because
that's what you asked me for.
Okay, I want a good argument.
Well,
I want you to persuade me. I'm working. This dialogue is supposed to generate the right.
Well, I understand, Your Honor, but what the problem that we're all having on the defense side of this is we have told you from the beginning, Your Honor, that if they are going to present evidence about what happened to Kathie Durst, then the complete story should be told to the jury. And you have told us no. So now, when somebody starts doing it again, your complaint to me was that I didn't object because it was irrelevant, but we've made a record over and over again that, in fact, all this stuff about Kathie's death is irrelevant, disappearance, with them prosecuting the murder, which is what they've done, Your Honor. That's why we've been here so long.
Look, I would welcome any testimony you presented that wasn't hearsay. I mean, that's the bottom line, is that you've told me that you believe there's a constitutional right to present any kind of hearsay, and I don't think that's true.
It's not being offered for the truth, Your Honor. It's being offered to show what this detective did and why he conducted his investigation the way he did.
Right, which isn't relevant. So, okay.
I understand the parameters.
Okay. Got it?
In the court inquiry, we offered a stipulation, which even though the court's ruled against it, I'm still willing to, if they want the stipulation, that the court will instruct the jury that they are not to consider why it was that Detective Becerra did not contact Susan Berman, but only that he did not do that. And you can strike his, I'm willing to...
Many times, Mr. Lewin, parties would rather present the evidence and have a dry stipulation presented to the jury. They want to have something to say, and this is what they have.
No, Your Honor, the point that I'm making is Mr. Chesnoff stood up. The way this started was he said, "Hey, listen, you asked that question, Mr. Bailey, and now Detective Becerra said, here's why he talked to Susan Berman, and we want to prove that that isn't true." So I'm saying, okay, if that's truly what your concern is, we're willing to stipulate to undo that. But as the court's aware, it turned out that wasn't really what they wanted. They want to bootstrap everything else. So I'm still saying, no, the court has denied their request. I'm still willing to stipulate to that if they would like it.
I might instruct him anyway. That's
okay.
Fine. You can just present the instruction, and I'll consider giving it to him. You don't have to give anything up. I'll do it.
I just want to say one last thing, Your Honor, and then I'm ready to proceed.
Yeah.
With your permission. How is the complete investigation not relevant? The complete investigation includes what he did and chose not to do as part of his investigation.
Right. So what is relevant is an ultimate fact. In other words, that Susan Berman was killed with malice aforethought, and the other fact is she was killed because she's a witness to a crime. And so what a detective does is interesting. It gives context to actual evidence, which is presented to the jury for their determination. What the detective may think, typically it's not good for the defense. Typically it's, I think he's guilty. And that would not be something that's not a hearsay exception you want. You want a hearsay, you want the jury to make the decision based on the evidence, not based on what a detective thinks. Now here you think that might be useful to the defense to let in what a detective thinks, but because their thinking changed over time, and the original thoughts where there wasn't enough evidence, I understand why you want to present it. It just does not tend to prove a fact that matters to the determination of the verdict. So that's how I see it. But you're free in your argument to say the investigation was wonderful, the investigation was terrible, whatever you want to argue. It's not an element.
I can inquire of them that multiple witnesses were interviewed in New York. I mean, we can do that, can't we, Your Honor?
I think the people that he interviewed is fair game. What he did, he's testified that he's doing investigation. I think that's fair game, but not the statements.
Okay, I got to read one more thing.
The only issue, you don't have any problem asking him about witnesses that they interviewed, as long as those witnesses are relevant to this case. So that means, since the court has already said that you're not letting in the elevator operator stuff, you can't bring in, well, did you go interview Eddie Lopez? So if they want to ask him, did you interview Dean Cooperman? They can certainly say that. Then the next step would be, before you can get any information about what Dean Cooperman told you, you've got to be able to say it's either a consistent or inconsistent statement, and you cannot ask the witness what he thinks about the testimony, because it's not it's not that it's hearsay, it's that it's an inappropriate opinion.
Well, let's talk about that. Right. Well, I think I made that pretty clear. But here it's a suggestion. Did you talk to a man who was an elevator operator in the building, and his name is Eddie Lopez?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Next question. I mean, what did he say? You can't. That's hearsay.
Yeah, Your Honor, if that would, obviously, the hair goes up on the back of my neck when I hear it, because I've been counting. Within the Durst prosecution team, we made a bet very early on over how many times this issue would come up. I have won the bet 3 times over because it is 3 times more. This issue comes up.
I'm going to look for the hairs on the back of your neck, Mr. Lewin, and see if I should brace myself to rule on an objection. Okay, that's my early warning system.
So,
Our poor jurors waiting in the hallway.
Your Honor?
Can we get, something else?
Yep. Most respectfully, the evidence shows she was not a witness, Your Honor, that I want to bring out. That's a critical element. Witness killing is the crux of their prosecution, that Susan made the call. Sarah found no evidence that Susan made the call. To the contrary, found evidence that she did not make the call. Therefore, a stated reason for withholding the contact with Susan Berman is incorrect or incomplete. In addition, Your Honor, the prosecution theory is shoddy investigation by Struck, but Becerra refutes that by relying on Struck's investigation and acting accordingly and conducting his own investigation.
Your record is made. Let's go.
thank
Okay.
you. Your Honor, as the jury's coming in, I sent the court an email regarding an issue that came up last week.
Oh, you mean the one you sent me this morning?
I think Mr. Lewis sent an email this morning. I can't remember if I responded to it, but that issue is closed as far as we're
Yeah, I enjoyed reading it at the break of day, or maybe a little before. Since Mr. Durst is present, and Mr. Chesnoff, and Mr. DeGuerin. See Mr. Garcia's assisting, but not appearing. And we have Mr., not appearing officially, but welcome. We have Mr. Lewin, Mr. Bailey, and Mr. Milius, and Mr. Henderson. Detective Becerra has resumed the witness stand. I'll remind you you're under oath. And Mr. Chesnoff, you may cross-examine the witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Investigator Becerra. How are you?
Good afternoon, sir. Fine, thank you.
Good. So, the New York State Police are also state troopers, like patrolling the freeways and the throughways, et cetera, correct?
Synonymous. State troopers and state police are the same
Right.
organization.
You wear those Smokey the Bear hats when you're,
Stetsons.
is that what they are?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And you've had a long career with one particular agency, correct?
The only career.
Okay. Have you been involved in homicide investigations other than this one?
Yes, I have.
Could you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury how many, approximately?
Thank goodness, not a whole lot. Probably half a dozen to a dozen.
Okay. And have you testified in courts in New York State on a regular basis during your career?
Yes.
Okay, so it's not your first time on the witness stand, correct?
Just a little rusty because of COVID.
Okay, all of us. The New York State Police and the NYPD worked in conjunction on the investigation of Kathie Durst. Is that correct?
No.
Not initially?
My understanding, no. Initially, well, there were 2 different reports made, one by Gilberta and Jamie, I believe, to the state police, and then Robert Durst to the NYPD.
Okay. And so they were running parallel, at least? I mean, you mentioned earlier that you found a very thin file on the New York State side, correct?
It was not extremely thin, but it wasn't a lot of information in it, yes.
Okay, but did it include some of the investigative steps that have been taken by the New York State Police, for example?
Yes, Trooper Harney at the time.
Okay, along with whoever had jurisdiction in South Salem, local police as well?
No, just the state police.
Okay, so the state police, when it all began, went and were involved in different steps of investigation up in South Salem, correct?
Yes.
Okay, but the bulk of the investigation occurred in New York City, correct?
That is correct.
And I think that Mr. Balian showed you a picture of the Katona train station, did he not?
Yes, sir.
And the Katona train station is a station that provides commuter transportation for people in the South Salem area to eventually wind up in New York City, correct?
That is correct.
And the reason why you took the picture of the Katona police station, or somebody and law enforcement took it was because that's the location where Mr. Durst had said he put his wife on the train, correct?
That is correct.
To go into New York City, correct?
Correct.
And you mentioned to Mr. Balian that one of the things that you needed to do was not only review the little thin file from the New York State Police investigation, but you needed to sink your teeth into what had been done in New York, correct?
That is correct.
And in the course of doing that, you had an opportunity to read what was a pretty voluminous investigation, at least compared to what occurred in New York State Police, correct?
Their file folder was larger than ours, yes.
Okay. And the fellow that was most responsible, at least in large part in New York City, was a detective named Struck, correct?
Michael Struck, yes.
And when you reached out to Mr. Struck, he was cooperative with you in trying to give you information, correct?
He was.
And at the time you reached him, he'd already retired, correct?
That is correct.
So here's a retired detective who had worked on the case, who's trying to assist his brother officer who is now taking over looking at this situation, correct?
That's correct.
And the New York Homicide Police in law enforcement circles had good reputation?
Sustained.
Okay. I probably already asked you this, but Detective Struck responded and was cooperative, correct?
He was.
And he spent time talking to you, did he not?
The few times I asked him to speak with me, he did.
And he shared with you answers to whatever questions you were asking him, correct?
We basically just spoke about the case, but correct.
Right, but whatever details you were interested in, you would ask Detective Struck a question, correct?
Yes.
And then Detective Struck would respond, correct?
Yes.
And in the course of that, you didn't have to beat Detective Struck over the head to get him to answer. He was talking to you one officer to another.
Yes.
Fair? Okay. Now, the investigation, well, let's start here. You mentioned that you had been contacted by a fellow by the name of Tim Martin, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And Tim Martin was a sex offender, wasn't he?
I don't know if he had to register as one, but the act that he was convicted of was sexual in nature.
Right, back then it might not have required registration, but if you expose yourself to women and engage in a sexual act today, you'd have to register,
You could
correct?
register as a level 1, 2, or 3 sex offender, yes.
And you are the one who arrested this pervert, right?
I arrested that individual, yes.
Okay, well, you'd call him a pervert, wouldn't you?
We'll stipulate that if you're exposing yourself to women, you are in fact a pervert.
Okay.
Depends on the circumstances, doesn't it? No, that's a 50s joke.
No, I wish I hadn't asked the question.
The 1850s, but okay.
In any event, Detective, you knew that this fellow had been arrested for this sex offense when he contacted you, correct?
Yes.
And you understood at the time that the reason he was contacting you was not as just some good Samaritan, but as a person who was in trouble, about to be sentenced in front of a judge who was looking for leniency, correct?
He was basically asking me if I could speak to the judge on his behalf. I
Okay.
actually told him I really can't speak to your character. I don't know you well, but he said he wanted to offer me some information.
But for the ladies and gentlemen of the jury's benefit, oftentimes if somebody cooperates with the police in another investigation, the police or law enforcement or the DA will tell the judge that they were cooperative, correct?
Yes.
And so his motivation was to try to give you information that would give you an opportunity to either tell the DA or you personally to tell the judge that he'd done something good for law enforcement,
That is correct.
Okay. So you went and met with him, is that correct?
That is correct.
And he had his lawyer with him?
He did.
Okay. Did you have anybody with you?
No.
Okay. And you sit in an interrogation room, or was this at his lawyer's office?
Lawyer's office.
And he proceeds to tell you that he has information regarding the disappearance of Kathie Durst?
He called it a murder of a woman in South Salem.
Okay. And at that time, did you know anything about a murder of a woman in South Salem?
No, I did not.
Did you ask him for detail?
Yes.
Okay. And did he proceed to give you what he proposed? And let's see how this works. before you're going to agree to do anything to help this fella, you kind of want to know, you don't want to take a pig in a poke. You want...
That assumes the fact, not an evidence that he's going to do anything to help him.
Before you would make a decision, whether you would help an informant, you want to hear a little, you want a little meat on the bone. You want to hear what it is that they're offering you, correct?
Yes.
And did he share those things with you initially?
Basically, before we met, I was told about an unsolved murder in South Salem, and then we agreed to meet at the lawyer's office.
Okay. And when you got to the lawyer's office, did he tell you what he knew?
My understanding was it was his attorney, he was there, and his mother, and it was his mother that had the majority of the information.
Okay, so what he had was really hearsay, is that right?
Yes.
And did you then talk to the mother?
Yes, she was in the conversation.
Okay, and she shared with you different bits of information?
Yes, they would, nothing was, what's the word I want to look for? Nothing was exact, it was things that they heard. So they heard that Kathie was murdered.
Yeah, stop it. Okay. So the question didn't call for you to recount it, it just to ask you whether they said things to you.
Didn't have time for the formal objection of...
Stop work on that one.
Without going into what they said, did the subject of Mr. Durst come up?
Yes.
Okay. And at that time, were you aware that the disappearance of Mrs. Durst or Bob Durst were the subject of newspaper articles?
No.
Okay. Did you ask them how they knew this?
Yes.
Okay, and did they tell you that another relative of theirs had worked with the Dursts?
Was friendly with the Durst.
Okay. And ultimately, though, he told you that, and I'm not offering this for the truth, Your Honor, but...
I don't want to hear any statements. I don't want to hear
Okay,
any
as
of this
a result
hearsay.
of what he said to you, did you conduct some investigations?
Yes, I did.
And what did you do?
Objection relevance. This is...
Okay, stop. Just stop is our new word. Instead of objection, let's do stop.
I stopped.
All right, sidebar. All right, objection overruled.
So, Detective, based on what this fellow had told you, it piqued your interest, regardless of his background, et cetera, right?
Yes.
Okay, and that led you to do more than just the lake quadrant thing you talked about. You also went to two locations, kind of like when you went to the Pine Barrens. You went to two locations to dig and see if a body was located in a spot that this person or his mother had mentioned to you, correct?
What are the two locations, sir?
I thought one was his brother.
Wait, no, let's,
Okay.
don't
Okay.
ask him a question.
Oh.
Were there do you tell him?
No.
Were there two locations?
At any
Did
point in
you-
time, did you conduct some digs?
Yes.
Okay, and what was the time frame for that in relation to this interview?
Not long after.
Okay, and what were the two locations that you dug?
There weren't two locations.
Was it just one?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and where was that?
It was at the Durst residence on Hoyt Street in South Salem.
Okay, was there ever a search conducted at another location in Westchester County?
Except for the lake, no.
Okay, no search at Mr. Durst's brother's place?
No, we just did aerial surveillance with a helicopter.
Okay, and as a result of the digging that you did at the South Salem location, did you find Mrs. Durst?
No.
Okay. So, going back to the fellow that talked to you, you really made a determination that he had nothing to really offer, did he?
Of substance, no.
Okay. And it was kind of BS what he was telling you, right?
No, because I did look into it, and as I said, my interest was piqued by the fact that there was a missing woman.
Okay. But aside from the fact that as a police officer who's looking to do good, which we appreciate, there was nothing that the man or mother told you of substance that proved to be true regarding Mr. Durst, did it?
No.
I'm sorry.
correct.
I'm sorry, are you objecting?
No, Your Honor, I'm just trying to clarify the record. He answered a double negative. I think he means correct, but he said no, which would technically mean he's disagreeing with Mr. Chesnoff. So I'm just trying to correct for Mr. Chesnoff's benefit that I think the witness means correct, so the record's clear. That's all.
Do you want to ask it again, or?
No, I'm just happy that Mr. Lewin, it's taken 3 months, but Mr. Lewin's trying to do something for my benefit, Your Honor.
Okay, well, you
appreciate
know,
it.
We'll
I had a
stipulate that
feeling.
the answer was that the detective meant correct to your question, Mr. Chesnoff.
Thank you.
Okay, all right,
Okay.
granted.
The information didn't pan out, but it piqued your interest. Is that fair?
That is true.
Okay. Now, the husband in a homicide, or let's put it this way. If a man and a woman are living together and one of them, either the wife or the husband, turns up either missing or deceased, the other spouse is pretty much automatically a suspect, at least in the beginning of an investigation, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And you would agree with me that there's a lot more than there should be, obviously, domestic violence situations, correct?
Yes.
But they don't always necessarily lead to a homicide, do they?
No.
Okay. There's domestic violence occurrences, unfortunately, on a regular basis, but it doesn't follow that there has to be some kind of a murder associated with it. Is that fair?
That is fair.
Okay. So once your interest got piqued, this is in 1999,
Yes, sir.
okay? You went to your superiors and said, I'd really like to dig into this, no pun intended.
That is correct.
Okay. And you did, correct?
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
And in the course of doing that, you got the file from New York to review, correct?
Yes.
And what month in 99, do you remember?
Case was reopened in the end of November of '99. I think I got the case file maybe in December or maybe the beginning of the year, but I think it was December. I'm not sure.
This is almost a full year before Ms. Berman is murdered, is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. And who ultimately was responsible for the decision to permit you to reopen the investigation?
My immediate supervisor.
Okay. So between 1981 and 1999, there had been no investigation conducted by law enforcement that you were aware of, correct?
Your Honor, that's irrelevant based on the first
Except, you can't, don't argue it. Overruled.
Correct?
None that I was aware of.
Okay. Now, you told us earlier that Detective Struck was retired, but you spoke to him and told him you were looking into the case, correct?
Yes.
And you agreed that he was cooperative, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, would you agree that he cared about the investigation?
That's going to call for speculation.
You mean
It's
if
also
motion calls for
relevant.
speculation?
And irrelevant.
Sustained.
Okay. He didn't seem disinterested to you, did he?
No.
And from your review of the records, the NYPD homicide detectives had spent a lot of time on the case, correct?
That's going to call for speculation. It's also outside the scope, and it's irrelevant at 352 regarding specifically what he thinks of the original investigation.
So remember what I was saying about speaking objections? Speaking of investigations, your objection may not be in sentences. That's what speaking is. Okay? That's a speaking objection. Objection sustained.
You knew that an investigation was performed from a review of the files for over 2 years after Kathie disappeared in 1982, correct?
That misstates the evidence.
The witness may answer.
Yes.
You knew that many witnesses were interviewed by Detective Struck and other officers, and detectives, including a dean at the medical school, correct?
I believe so.
Okay, Dean Cooperman, does that,
Name rings a bell, yes.
okay. And did you ever conduct an interview yourself with Dean Cooperman?
I believe I did.
Okay, do you remember telling that to the fellows from the Jinx, that you had spent time with Dean Cooperman, correct?
I may have, or they might have brought it up, but it sounds
And-
familiar.
And you had an opportunity to talk to Dean Cooperman about the subject of whatever questions you had concerning Kathie Durst and Einstein, correct?
Yes.
And in your opinion, was Dean Cooperman cooperative with you?
He appeared to be, yes.
Answered your questions?
To the best of his recollection, yes.
And do you remember whether or not, without telling us what he said, Dean Cooperman had a memory of having had a conversation with Kathie Durst?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Do you recall Dean Cooperman telling you that he had a memory of having had a conversation with Kathie Durst?
I believe he did.
Were you aware that there was a suggestion?
That's going to be, the question is going to be objectionable. I'm concerned that the question
Okay.
is read.
Okay, think about your question.
I'm trying, Your Honor.
Yeah, yeah.
Hard to-
So it's, you want to present a statement? Is that where you're getting to?
Just 1 second, Your Honor, I'll figure out how to do it.
Okay.
Let me ask you this. When you interviewed Dean Cooperman, had you previously acquired any information that anybody connected with Mr. Durst in any way had contacted Dean Cooperman?
That question's
Stay.
vague. It's also going to call for hearsay.
Sustained base.
Did you ask Dean Cooperman if he had received a call from Kathie Durst?
You know, we would have the
No, that one's,
hearsay unless a prior consistent or prior
right, no,
consistent.
no, you're gonna read the statement to him.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Chris, LADA 147659. And Your Honor, to avoid,
Make sure you see it.
That is not the statement that he took.
Okay, then,
been
sustained.
through this.
We must, if he took a statement from, then you may read that statement.
Fourteen seven 659. I'm going to move on for now while Chris tries to find that for us, Your Honor. After speaking to Cooperman, did you do any follow-up as a result of your interview with Cooperman?
Personally, I don't think so. I think another group of guys may have years later.
Okay, but let me make it even more narrow. As a result of your interview with Cooperman, did you ever pick up the phone and call Susan Berman?
No.
Did you ever ask Susan Berman at any time whether she spoke to Dr. Cooperman?
No.
Did you ever call Susan Berman and ask her, well, let me ask it this way. Did you uncover during any of the investigation that you were doing, any physical evidence that Bob Durst ever spoke to Susan Berman between January 31st and February 3rd of the year that Kathie disappeared?
Question is vague. It's also
Vague, yeah,
irrelevant as
just
phrased.
No, okay. You continue to make speaking objections. You state the grounds with one word. If there's two objections, 2 words. Otherwise, I'm going to overrule them. So restate it because it's vague.
Sir, did you ever uncover in the course of the investigation that you conducted at any time any physical evidence like a phone bill or a note, anything at all to show that Susan Berman had ever talked to Bob Durst between January 31st and February 3rd?
I don't recall.
You don't recall?
I don't know if I,
Well, that would be a big one for you, wouldn't it?
yeah, it would be, but I'm just trying to think if it was done by other law enforcement involved.
Okay, well,
If I saw something, you know what I mean? That's all.
take
Well,
your
listen,
time.
listen. Okay, listen to the question.
Okay.
Can't answer only the question. Question is about you. What you
I
did.
personally know
So you were the lead investigator, correct?
of the reopening, yes.
Okay. And in the course of being the lead investigator, at no time did you personally or do you have any memory of ever seeing a single piece of physical evidence showing that Mr. Durst had spoken to Susan Berman between January 31st and February 3rd, correct?
Correct.
Now, you talked earlier about having reviewed the history of the prior investigation. Were you aware that officers initially had gone to Bob's home in South Salem?
I believe so, yes.
And were you aware that Bob had voluntarily let them in?
Your Honor, that's going to call for,
I'm sorry.
as soon as facts not an evidence, it's also speculation, it's also irrelevant, it's also outside the scope.
Overruled.
I don't recall.
Okay. Would you have a report that would refresh your recollection? Or let me ask it to you this way. You reviewed all the reports you could, correct?
I did.
And you are telling the jury at this time you have no memory that Mr. Durst voluntarily permitted the police to enter his home. Is that right?
If you have a report that shows that and refresh my recollection, that would be great.
Okay, I'll get that for you. You have information that Mr. Durst had offered a reward for Miss Durst, for information about where Miss Durst was?
Hearsay, outside the
Sustained.
scope.
Did
The
you,
same.
it's one of the investigative steps that you took was to review what different people had done that would be associated with Mrs. Durst, correct?
Objection based on court's prior ruling, Your Honor,
Yeah.
in chambers.
Sustained.
Would you agree with me that hundreds of leads were followed, either by your predecessors or by yourself?
Same
Okay.
objection.
Sustained sidebar. Let's go.
You can use that.
Just make sure we get that back in.
You got it. Make an airplane out of it. Detective, do you remember interviewing Dr. Cooperman?
Yes.
Do you remember Dr. Cooperman telling you, Dr. Cooperman stated on the morning of Monday, 2100, a student named Kathie Durst called him to state that she was ill with diarrhea and would not be in for classes. Dr. Cooperman stated that he thought the caller was Kathie Durst, but could not say for sure. Dr. Cooperman acknowledged that it is highly unusual for students so near graduation to call a dean when they are calling in sick.
The only correction is he actually only said 2000, 1982.
1980. No, 82. Well, it says 000 here. That's why I said it. I quoted it.
Yeah, do you want to read it again?
No, Your Honor, the problem is in the report, it has the wrong date.
Yeah, you can read it again or correct the date, either way.
Counsel, we'll stipulate, to make it easy, that the report has the date 2100.
Yeah.
That the report should have said 2182. So stipulated, counsel?
So stipulated.
Does court accept that, Your Honor?
Yes.
Thank you.
You recall that?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you also recall being interviewed by the gentleman from the Jinx?
Yes.
Okay. And do you remember telling them that you had spoken to Dr. Cooperman?
May have.
Okay. Do you remember telling them he remembered the call because of the interview by the city police back at the time, and he felt pretty confident that it was Kathie who had called and that it was on a particular day? Remember saying that?
I may have. I don't remember.
Okay, may I approach?
We have a stipulation that the date of this interview you didn't give it was 3/26/2014.
Correct.
Court accept that stipulation, Your Honor?
Yeah.
Can I ask you this, John,
Yeah.
so I don't have to put all
Sure.
this up on the
Yeah.
screen? Will you stipulate that that's what was said?
Yes.
Okay.
We'll do that
Yes.
after?
So there will be a stipulation, Your Honor, that, that Detective Becerra responded. He remembered the call because of the interview by the city police back at the time, and he felt pretty confident that it was Kathie who had called and that it was on that particular day.
Okay, so parties stipulate, then the court accepts the stipulation as to the previous statement of this witness.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned earlier that you had done follow-up forensic work, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And forensic work is very important for police work in general, correct?
It is.
And it becomes especially important when investigating a homicide, is that correct?
It is one
Okay.
part of the investigation, but yes, it is.
Okay, so one of the things that you look for is DNA, correct?
Yes.
Blood, correct? Is that yes?
Yes.
Fingerprints?
Yes.
Okay. So when you told Mr. Balian that your investigators had gone back into the house once you were re-engaged or engaged to take out portions of the house to study them, that was an important police step, wasn't it?
That was part of the investigation, yes.
Right, because you're trying to find evidence, for example, that there had been an altercation in the house, correct?
Or something nefarious happened in the house, yes.
Right. Now, there were stairs in this house, correct?
Yes, sir.
And when you went back in, you had access to those stairs, correct?
I did.
And so you could gather any evidence that you wanted from those stairs to do forensic examinations, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And I know you said that over time, sometimes, I don't know what the word would be, but that the evidence deteriorates, maybe? Is that what you were trying to reference?
Yes, or things moved in the house. The house changed over the years.
Right, but you went to specific spots in the house that have been identified as potential places to find evidence, correct?
Yes.
Like there was the idea that behind the wall there might be a hidden room or something, correct?
Not a hidden room, just a little space.
A cubby, correct?
About 5 inches.
Okay, where maybe a weapon could be hidden, correct?
Any type of evidence,
Okay,
yes.
well, I mean, you weren't doing this so that, you know, you were doing it for police purposes, right?
Yes, sir.
It wasn't like as lackadaisical as you're kind of presenting it. It was a serious operation, wasn't it, Detective
was.
Inspector? And the hope is that you're going to find material that will link somebody to a crime, correct?
That is correct.
But of course, if there's nothing there to begin with, you're not going to find any link, are you?
How do I answer that question?
Well, if there's no evidence, you can't make it evidence, can you?
True. Well, we did not find evidence.
Right. and you had every opportunity to do any kind of test that the police in New York are capable of doing, correct?
Our search of the residence was, I'm not going to say the word minimal, but we weren't too evasive either because it was a new homeowner and we did not want to intrude on her privacy.
Yeah, but she'd let you in, correct?
She did.
She let you take out a whole section of her house, didn't she?
It was just a 6x8 panel of wood.
Well, there was nothing to indicate she wasn't cooperating with you.
She was very
there?
cooperative, but we didn't want to take advantage of her kindness either.
Well, except when you're investigating the disappearance of somebody, when you balance the kindness against the potential for finding out if something happened there, that's more important, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And nobody inhibited you from doing anything you had wanted to do. Anything you didn't do was a police choice, correct?
Yes.
Now, apparently, there was a portion of the paneling at some point in time that showed several dark-colored fingerprints. Is that right?
That is correct.
And those fingerprints did not come back to Mr. Durst, did they?
They didn't come back to anyone.
Okay. That wood paneling that you took out was 36 inches by 22 and a half inches. Is that approximately what it was?
Almost the size of this, I would say the size of this desktop here.
Were there fingerprints on that as well? If you recall?
That's what we're talking about, the thing that had the dark markings on it we thought were fingerprints.
And the wood was tested for blood, correct?
Yes, sir.
That's another kind of test that can be done, correct?
Yes.
And that came back negative for blood, correct?
My understanding, yes.
And even though some evidence may degrade, I think that's a better word than deteriorate, some evidence may degrade, evidence for purposes of homicide investigations and cold cases can be found years later, correct?
That calls for speculation,
Well,
also assumes an
can't-
expertise.
Overruled, well, okay, that's true. Foundation? Well, you'd think you'd have it.
Have
but
you
asked.
utilized forensic evidence in the course of your work as a policeman?
I do not, we have a forensic identification unit, and they're the ones that handle all those type of issues at crime scenes.
Right, but if you identify something that you want this team to work on, you delegate it to them, correct?
They're usually the ones that find it and make me aware of it.
Okay. But on occasion, in your police career, have you found a piece of evidence that you want tested?
Yes.
Okay. And then you turn it over to the forensic people, correct?
Yes, and they process it.
Okay. Did there come a point in time where there was a search of a crawl space in the house?
Yes, sir.
And were search dogs used?
Yes.
And as a result of that search, nothing was found either, correct?
No.
Nothing at all suggesting that something untoward had occurred in that location, correct?
Nothing of evidentiary value was discovered.
And nothing linking anything in that location to Mr. Durst, correct?
Correct.
Do you remember that in March of 2000, law enforcement went back into the South Salem home and searched the kitchen for forensic evidence?
Yes,
And nothing was found there either, correct?
that is correct.
And that's the same day that you folks searched the lake, correct?
Quite possibly, yes, I believe so.
And they searched for hours, did they not?
Yes, they did.
And they didn't find anything, did they?
Couple roots.
Couple of what?
Roots, hard roots that may have looked like bones, but no.
Okay. So with all the resources that you had available and the further investigation, you found no evidence supporting that Bobby Durst had hurt Mrs. Durst in the house or she had accidentally died in the house, did you?
None that I found.
None that anybody that you were working with found either, correct?
Correct.
I'd probably ask you this, but at no time did you find any physical evidence showing that Mr. Durst had talked to Susan Berman to plot any kind of strategy for Mr. Durst as far as an alibi, did you?
That is correct.
Do you know where the rumor or the theory that Susan Berman had called the school began?
Objection, relevance, also calling for hearsay, also outside the scope.
Sustain.
Were you in meetings with the LADA? Where the LADA or the LAPD suggested that Ms. Berman had called the medical school? You recall
Objection,
that?
relevance, outside the
Sustained.
scope, calling for hearsay.
Sustain.
Did you watch the movie All Good Things?
I did.
Okay, did you watch that in your capacity as a law enforcement officer?
No?
You just watched it for fun?
Well, just something to watch, yes.
Okay, so you didn't think it was worthy of watching it for any other purpose than entertainment?
No, I watched it because it was based on, loosely based on this case.
Do you recall in watching the movie that theory was postured in the movie?
Which theory are we talking about now?
That Susan Berman called the medical school?
Your Honor, objection, relevance, 352, also based on the court's
No,
rulings in
okay.
chamber.
I think it's outside the scope. I'll sustain it on those grounds.
Now, along the way, you were contacted by various journalists and authors, correct?
Correct.
The fellows who made the Jinx, correct?
Yes, sir.
You participated in the production or interviews for them, correct?
I helped him a little bit, yes.
Okay. And were you doing that to further the investigation or for your own personal reasons?
Probably a little bit of both.
Were you paid anything?
No.
Okay. There came a point in time where Ms. Pirro became involved in this, is that right?
In what?
In the investigation,
Yes.
okay? And that was before Mr. Durst had gone on trial in Galveston, is that not right?
That is correct.
Okay, so prior to Mr. Durst going on trial in Galveston, Ms. Pirro inserted herself, correct?
Yes.
And you and Ms. Pirro didn't hit it off too well, did you?
We did early on.
Okay, but later on,
That's a fair assumption.
and Ms. Pirro made some false accusations about you,
Yes.
and they're personal, so I'm not going to ask you about them, but they were untrue, right?
That is correct.
Okay, and it was Ms. Pirro who had you removed from the case,
That is correct.
and in part, was it because Ms. Pirro wanted all the attention?
I can't speak for her motives.
I'm not going to do that to him. No, I know that. It's fair to say that Ms. Pirro made personal allegations against you that were untrue, correct?
That is correct.
And they were embarrassing, were they not?
Yes.
And it didn't do much to help figure out what happened to Kathie Durst either, did it?
No, it did not.
Did you have to ask permission as a result of Ms. Pirro before you spoke to, for example, people in the media?
I guess that's a gray area. It wasn't really, I needed to ask for permission, and I just knew that there point in time came where she handled all media for the investigation.
Okay, it's fair to say that it's not out of the ordinary for policemen to speak to reporters and reporters to speak to policemen because sometimes you guys share information. Is that fair?
That is correct.
Okay, so for you not to be able to speak to a journalist could actually inhibit your ability to gather information for the investigation. Is that fair?
That's fair to say.
At some point in time, did you get contacted by the FBI
Yes.
about this?
Sorry. Yes,
About
sir.
Mr. Durst?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And did that lead ultimately to some meetings in Los Angeles with multiple law enforcement agencies?
It did.
And Mr. Lewin was present at those?
Yes, sir.
Detective Shamalian?
Yes.
Okay. And you had one meeting that lasted several days, correct?
I think it lasted a day or two, if I recall correctly, but
And
yes.
you were all brainstorming, correct?
Yes.
And Mr. Lewin was leading the meeting, correct?
We all put in input.
But he was directing traffic?
The ringmaster, yes.
Okay. So I'd be surprised if you said no. By the way, when you were in the Pine Barrens, you didn't find anything of a physical evidentiary nature that linked Mr. Durst to Kathie's disappearance? You didn't find her, right?
I did not.
Okay. You went down to a location based on some phone records, correct?
That is correct.
And was that your idea to go there?
I wanted to go down there, yes.
Now, when you were in this meeting, was it agreed that in order to prosecute Mr. Durst for Ms. Berman's homicide, that a motive would have to be provided?
Objection relevant.
Sustained.
Outside the scope.
Would it be fair to say that a theory of prosecution was developed at the meeting?
Say it again, I'm sorry?
Would it be fair to say that a theory of prosecution was developed at the meeting?
Objection relevance outside the scope. Assumes facts not in evidence.
First two, sustained.
Were you aware that Mr. Jarecki and the Jinx producers were working with law enforcement?
That assumes facts not in evidence.
Fact, not evidence. Sustained.
Well, that's why I'm asking him,
Well, it's.
to put him in evidence.
It's
Court's made a legal finding, Your Honor.
it's sustained.
What did you say, Dick? I thought there was a stipulation that they were working together, Your Honor, but is that not right, John?
That is incorrect.
Okay.
I stand corrected.
Okay, sustained.
In my role as ringleader, right? Saying that.
Detective, did you have interaction with Susie Giordano?
Yes, I did.
And you went to her home, is that right?
I did.
And she was cooperative with you?
She was.
She was very respectful?
Yes.
She didn't ask for an attorney?
No.
And she made boxes available to you that she had been storing at her house where her parents lived, correct?
That's correct.
And she handed them over to you, correct?
Yes.
Now, you have told us that Ms. Berman was going to be one of the people that you interviewed, is that correct?
That is correct.
And so you started in '99, and you said it lasted at least a year before her homicide, correct?
Correct.
And you told us that you had gotten the idea of calling her from family members, correct?
Calling her or visiting her, yes, from
Okay.
family and friends.
But in no time did you ever go and talk to her, did you?
I did not.
You never called her on the phone,
I did not.
never sent her an email,
I did not.
never went to her house.
I did not.
So-
And I did after she was deceased, but,
Right.
okay.
So, as you sit here, you have no idea what evidentiary information Ms. Berman could have provided anybody about Ms. Durst's disappearance, do you?
I didn't get the chance.
Okay. And that was by your choice, correct?
It was.
Okay. Did anybody else that was a policeman that you know of before Ms. Berman died ever take the time to go ask Ms. Berman if she had called Einstein?
That's going to assume facts not in evidence, call for hearsay
Sustained.
outside the scope.
Okay. Did anybody working with you ever contact Ms. Berman?
Asked and answered.
Overruled.
No.
And of course, you would have been aware as lead investigator if anybody had, correct?
That is correct.
And finally, in the course of your review, not finally, but in course of your review of the investigative files in New York, did you ever come across anybody thinking that Ms. Berman needed to be talked to? Ever?
Reviewing the New York City files?
Yes.
I really don't recall, to tell you the truth. I remember it was Kathie's friends and family who told me that I should interview her.
Right, but as you sit here today, not a single police officer ever thought Susan Berman important enough to interview, did they?
That's going to call for
Just saying.
speculation, proper
Okay,
opinion.
though I might overrule it. you see.
But I'm trying to state
Can I ask-
multiple grounds, Your Honor.
Okay, but state, just, I recognize them if you identify them with a single word.
I think I said speculation and then you,
Right. Sustained.
Court's indulgence, and I'm
Yes.
probably finished.
Yes.
Mr. Becerra, is it fair to say that as far as contacting Miss Berman, you had never in your mind decided you were going to ask her if she'd called the medical school, had you?
It all depended on how our interview would go.
Okay, but that wasn't something that was driving you to go speak to Miss Berman, was it?
I wanted to speak to Ms. Berman because I was told she was very close with Mr. Durst.
But it
And
wasn't.
that she might have important information relative to Kathie's disappearance.
Yeah, but it wasn't the question of whether or not she had called Einstein, was it?
That wasn't the sole reason, no.
That wasn't a reason.
It all depended how the interview went.
Well, did you ever write anywhere in a report or in your diary or your journals or whatever notes you kept, I need to speak to Susan Berman about whether she called Einstein?
No, I did not.
Nothing further.
You, Rick?
Did you, were you ever made aware that, strike. You talked about All Good Things, and you watched All Good Things, and that was released in around 2010. Is that when you would have watched it?
Yes.
Were you actually working on the case at this time?
No.
You discussed the staircase in the house.
Yes.
Was there laundry in the house?
I'm sorry?
Was there laundry in the house?
At the time that I looked at it, I don't recall. I believe there was a laundry machines downstairs, but I don't know what the configuration was back in 1982.
Okay, but at least when you looked at it, the laundry was downstairs?
I believe so.
In that
Yes.
basement area?
I'm sorry?
In the basement?
I believe so.
These fingerprints that you tested, and you said they didn't come back to anyone. Do you mean they were identifiable fingerprints that couldn't come back to anyone, or they weren't sufficient quality to match to anyone?
They were insufficient to come back to anyone, so they were not unidentifiable.
Okay, so in other words, there wasn't enough information at that time after those years left, enough detail in the fingerprint to match to anybody?
That's correct.
You went back and did this forensic examination. Now this is 20 years later after 1982 approximately, right?
Yes.
And how many owners later?
I'd say at least 3 maybe, 2 or 3.
And were there any remodels done on the house?
I was told that there was.
And
Move to strike, Your Honor, hearsay.
it's not for the truth, not for the truth of the matter.
Overruled.
okay. And so it's 20 years later, a couple of owners at least later, some remodels later. We talked about on cross-examination your hopes of finding evidence in the house. I mean, it's great to hope. My question is not whether you hope to find evidence in the house. My question is, did you actually have an actual expectation, based on your years of experience as a peace officer, that you would find evidence in the house?
Not really, not over that period of time.
We talked about, on cross-examination, Mr. Chesnoff asked you about whether there was any investigation done between, and I think he might have spoke, he said between 1981 and 1999. And I assume you're talking about other than the initial investigation that was done in 1982, is that right?
What's the question again? I'm sorry.
When Mr. Chesnoff asked you if there was any investigation done that you were aware of between 1981 and 1999, you said yes. You're aware Kathie disappeared in January of 1982?
1982, yes.
Okay.
I didn't think I had the opportunity to correct him at that point.
Okay, I just want to make sure the record's
Yeah.
clear. And you're talking about other than whatever initial investigation was originally done?
From New York City, yes.
We talked about, Mr. Chesnoff asked you all these questions about domestic violence, and your experience as a peace officer doesn't always lead to murder, right?
That's correct. Thank goodness.
Thank goodness, yes. Does, in your experience as a peace officer, domestic violence sometimes does escalate to murder?
Yes, it does.
In cases, in your experience as a peace officer, where you have a homicide that's committed between people in a couple relationship, and the murders happen, in your experience, how often is it in those situations there always was pre-existing domestic violence?
There was.
We talked about whether or not you did or did not speak with Ms. Berman.
Correct.
And you've testified that your plan was you were going to speak to Ms. Berman.
That is correct.
And you were waiting to finish your investigation on Kathie, whatever you were doing there.
That is correct.
Okay. Do you wish eventually you had an opportunity to ask her some questions you'd like to ask her?
Absolutely.
And what prevented you eventually from doing that?
She was murdered.
You talked about would you like to ask her today as you sit here whether she made that call to Albert Einstein?
Objection, Your Honor. Argument, speculation.
Stay.
Obviously you can't ask her any questions today. You're aware of that?
That is correct.
Okay. And we talked about going down the pine barrens and you didn't find Kathie's body. Did you take a shovel with you?
I did not.
Did you dig around in the pine barrens?
I did not.
Why not?
Pine Barrens is huge. I had no point of reference where to search. I just wanted to get a feel for how long it would take to go there from South Salem and different points of interest down there.
It's thousands and thousands of acres, right?
Minimal, yes.
And without some idea of where to look, would you even have an idea of where to begin?
No clue.
Do you think that's even a reasonable search based on your experience as a peace officer to be able to conduct?
No.
Well, I said thousands, but do you know exactly how many acres
Hundreds
it
of
is?
thousands.
I mean, do you know exactly how many acres
I
it is?
think it's several 100,000 acres.
Okay. It's a very large area.
It is.
I have nothing further.
Chesnoff. Thank you. Sir, you were asked about the forensic efforts that were made after a couple of owners had already been in the house. Remember that?
Yes, sir.
But as I asked you previously, you can't find evidence if it wasn't there to begin with, can you?
If it's not there, that is an obvious yes.
One of the reasons that it would not be there is if nothing happened there, right?
If nothing happened there, there's not going to be any evidence, yes.
Okay? And you know of cases from your experience where forensic experts have found evidence years, even decades later, don't you?
Some.
I mean, that happens, right?
It has happened in the past, yes.
You wouldn't have gone back in to look if you weren't of the belief that something could be recovered, correct?
That's correct.
And these areas that were taken out, they were kind of hidden areas, right? Not trafficked. Is that fair?
Yes.
So there will be a better chance of preservation if nobody had been back there in years, correct?
As I stated to Mr. Valiant, there was some renovations done, so I don't know what the layout of the house was back in 1982 as opposed to 1999 and 2000 when I was in the house.
But in the course of being a police officer, you folks can get plans from architects, from the city, from the county, so you can actually know what a place looked like, correct?
Some of them do the changes and not notify the zoning boards of their,
I understand that, but some do, correct? Correct?
Yes,
And in this case, you didn't look to see whether or not there really had been changes?
I do not.
Okay. And finally, I forgot to ask you this earlier. You mentioned that there were a leak of the story to the New York Times and the Daily News. Did you blame Miss Pirro for that?
I didn't blame her for it. She blamed me, I believe.
I understand.
Yes.
But in your opinion, do you think she protested too much? And that she was the one that leaked it?
I can't say.
Did you investigate who was responsible for that?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Nice to meet you, sir.
Pleasure.
You, come on. You are aware that Kathie Durst did live in that house, right?
Yes.
And you're aware that she lived in that house for some period of time.
Yes.
And yet, you didn't find her DNA in the house anywhere, right?
No.
You didn't find her fingerprints in that house, even though she lived there. You know she was there.
That's correct. No, we did not.
And is that out of the ordinary 20 years later?
No, because of new residents, house being cleaned, etc., renovations, it could be a number of reasons.
Thank you.
Okay, but
Yes.
to be clear, the only way you can check for DNA is if you take a sample of something. So if you took a sample, for example, in the shower drain where Miss Durst might have washed her hair and her hair went down, you secured hair, you could check to see the DNA, correct?
That is correct.
So you have to have something that you're looking at.
To test for, yes.
Right, and so when you go in to look, you're looking for evidence, correct?
Yes.
You're not just doing a general DNA check, are you?
That is correct.
Thank you.
No further questions. Thank you.
Surely you'd have another question.
No, thank you.
Wait, you're on a stop.
Can we, may this witness be excused?
Yes.
You're excused.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Judge.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for our recess until 3:30 p.m. Do not converse among yourselves or with anyone else on any subject connected with this case. Do not form or express any opinion on the case. We can go off the record.